Hi everybody, this is Wendy Adler bringing you another articulating talk. Today we're going to talk about isms. Every time you go to a museum you hear lots of ism terms, Romanticism and Classicism and Modernism, etc., etc. And that's a good way for us to describe various art periods, but what do those things actually mean? What kind of time periods do they actually cover? So we're going to do that today. I'm going to narrate you through about 200 years of isms. Here we go. So this lecture was inspired by a workshop I took last summer by Dr. Anna Tahinchi. She heads the art history department at the Glassell School from the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. It was so interesting to hear all the different isms and how they transitioned from one to the next. So I wanted to start this slide with artists break, bend, or blend, because I think that's the best way to explain how we ended up with so many different isms and art periods. What is an ism? As I say here, an ism is a style movement with a common philosophy used by a specific group in a specific time period. And my asterisk basically means except when it's not. What I mean is that the isms all can overlap. There can be traits and characteristics from one to the next, because really it's about artists that are trying to evolve. So that leads to that second quote. Evolution to revolution or revolt leads to change. So when a group of artists decide to use some characteristics from their current period, but then they either break completely from that or they alter them significantly enough to have a completely different type of art, that's how we get our bend or our blend or our complete break. Oftentimes an ism will also have neo or post prior to the word. The neo, of course, means, well, it was this ism, but now we have a new version of it. And the post means we really don't have a new ism altogether yet, but this is after what we just saw. So the neo or the post is kind of like a little variation on the current ism. Neoclassicism, for example, or post-expressionism. I want to define the difference between modern and contemporary art, because in the next 200 years of isms that we're going to talk about, a lot of them would be considered modern art periods. But modern is a pretty loose term. It is actually a defined period art. So art that we're seeing today is contemporary art. Modern art is going to end up being an ism later. So what do I mean by that? Modern means art that is generally defined as from the 1860s forward. It's kind of a sweeping ism, if you want to consider it that way. When I was being trained as a docent at the Modern in Fort Worth, I was trained that modern art was post-World War II forward. So that's a much more narrow definition than this one of 1860s forward. I mean, 1860s forward covers about 150 years of art. That's a lot of art. So the term modern can be a very broad definition. It also brings into question, what will the next art movement be named? It's not always modern art. Modern will end up being a defined time period, unlike contemporary art. Contemporary art is art that is being made today, generally by living artists who are actively working and producing right now. Now, you can also use the term contemporary to describe things that occurred during our lifetime. So, for example, Andy Warhol would be considered a contemporary pop artist, but of course, Andy Warhol has been dead for quite some time now. So we can use contemporary art to be a general distinction of art from the 1960s forward, or it can also talk about art that's currently happening now. So let's jump into our isms. I want to start with Romanticism, and I chose that one a little bit on the random side. But Romanticism is a pretty broad period of time. As you can see, it covers from 1780 to 1850. So we have some other isms that overlap during that time. But why Romanticism? Well, Romanticism was one of the first times that art was showing independence and individualism. It differs from the periods before it in that it doesn't focus on art from religious icons or sacred art, and it has a much broader variety of subject matter. Okay, so we have independence and individualism, and then we have a lot of romantic concepts that are being used. We have love and life and loss, and hence the name Romanticism. So it also introduces, in a more basic way, the concept of the sublime. Sublime is actually a defined term in art, and it deals with inconceivable greatness, almost something that goes beyond the emotion, something that moves you in such a way that it's really hard to define. Maybe it's the savagery of nature, and we have a great example of that here in this particular picture that I chose. This is called The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, and it was produced smack in the middle of our Romantic period here in 1817 by a German artist, Caspar Friedrich. We have him standing there and looking out over this beautiful scene from nature. And we do think that this is a self-portrait of Mr. Friedrich, by the way, or I guess I should say Herr Friedrich. It shows this beautiful mist over these mountains with powerful looking rocks and trees and distance and sky. And anybody that looks at this, I think, could catch the romantic nature of this picture. Next, we move away from the Romantic into the Academy. And this literally is a style that evolves from the French Académie des Beaux-Arts, which was considered the center of the art world in the 1800s. So again, we have a long period of time from 1790 up through about 1900, because this is a much more scholarly and academic approach. They're not interested in communicating any sort of political message. They're really not interested in a societal narrative. This is a much more stiff and idealized style. Now, it still can be very pretty, as we see here in this picture. This is actually a picture that we have at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston by William Bouguereau, and it's called The Elder Sister. This was painted in 1869. Here we have this beautiful young woman holding a baby on her lap. Presumably she's the sister, as the title tells us, but it's a pretty picture. We have a little bit of nature in the background. She's got a very pleasant look on her face. And so this is a much more scholarly approach. And sometimes you'll hear this referred to as Academicism or Academicism or Academicism. So it has a lot of different terms affiliated, but it all means the same thing. It's all coming from an academic approach to art. Now we start our social trends. We start with realism. In the 1840s, we had just finished a revolution in France. And so people were much more interested in how was society and community behaving, and how could artists show that. So this is kind of the anti-romantic, right? These are artists that are seeing what's going on around them and that want to be able to make pictures that depict what's happening in society today. So they're dealing with the everyday. When we do our toast points, and we ask about our first tea and toast, what type of art are we looking at? This is actually the quintessential genre picture. Pictures of people doing everyday activities. And we have a lot of artists that adapt this style of work. Here we have a beautiful piece done by Gustave Courbet, and this is called The Stonebreakers. This was painted in 1849 and sadly lost during World War II. But this shows the art of an everyday set of workers breaking up stone. Courbet was known for saying, "One can only paint what you see." So here, this would have been a scene that perhaps he was able to see. Now recognize that he was not painting this on site. This probably would have been a painting that he made based on sketches that he made on site, because paints were not yet portable. That comes very shortly in one of our next isms. And realism will get usurped later by photography. Artists wouldn't have needed to paint realistic pictures anymore because they could have gone out and used photography to document this kind of activity. So we have an ism here called modernism, and modernism is a little different than the definition that I gave you earlier on one of our early slides. Modernism actually talks about art post-realism. There's one of our posts right there. And it mixes elements of real and pretend. So it takes elements of realism, but then it expands what the artist is allowed to use. So it's not about perfection. It's really about fragmentation, and it's both objective and subjective art. I chose an example here by Auguste Rodin, who uses a lot of fragmentation in his sculptures. It's an entrepreneurial approach, which is very modern, right? And it uses masterpieces as its inspiration, but then it presents new takes. So here we have the sculpture Walking Man, which was first done in 1905. This is a bronze casting, and I didn't list a location for this because there were several castings, including one that we have in the Cullen Sculpture Garden at the museum. This particular one was based on a much earlier sculpture done of St. John the Baptist. But then, of course, Rodin was known for taking old classics and putting a very modern spin on them. This would have been very provocative back in the day. The fact that he has this very strong, powerful sculpture, but he hasn't given us a head and he's lopped off the arms. So we're only seeing part of the actual figure. Now we move into Impressionism, right? A big, deep breath of relief, something that everybody enjoys because it's so pretty. So what gave rise to Impressionism? A couple of things. Paints became portable. This is when oil paints were first produced in a tube, which allowed artists to leave their studios. So this overlaps modernism because there's a completely new approach to painting. People are able to leave their studios. This is all about the artist being able to capture what he both sees and feels. So he's out in nature and he's enjoying the fresh air and he's able to see the rustle of the trees and the movement of the clouds and the change in light. And he wants to capture that moment in time. So this is a completely different approach to art than, say, being stuck in your studio and painting a portrait or trying to rely on your imagination and paint religious figures. We also have Japanese influence from trade that is now occurring. A lot of Japanese woodblock prints were coming over from Asia on ships, and artists were enchanted by this exposure to a new style that they hadn't seen before. We know Van Gogh collected Japanese prints. We know a lot of these Impressionist artists were really influenced by the use of color and the completely different style than what they had seen before. So this is a very strong step away from what the Academy was doing, or from Academicism, right? So Monet, of course, was a leader in Impressionism. A lot of these Impressionists worked together. So Monet and Renoir and Degas and Caillebotte were all working together. They ended up forming a society of rebels so that they could exhibition together. But here's a pretty good example of an impressionistic work. This is called Vetois. It was done in 1880 by Claude Monet, and it's a beautiful outdoor landscape scene. We have trees, we have poppies in the front, we have some buildings or structures, it looks like, in that background. But this is a beautiful example of Impressionism. We have some motion with those cloud brushstrokes. We have suggestions of objects that we can recognize, but they're definitely not considered realistic portrayals. Monet said, "Forget the objects. Paint from color and shape until you have an impression of what you see before you." Post-Impressionism is almost like a bridge-ism. It's kind of a category where we put some artists who don't fit into Impressionism and they don't really fit into the next few isms that are coming. because they're pushing boundaries and they're using their intuition towards their own style. Definitely Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin fit into this category. Henri Rousseau, his work fits into this category, and it's an open exploration into the mind of the artist. We see recurring motifs. We see a lot of use of unnatural color. So for example, Henri Matisse might paint somebody's skin in green instead of a skin tone. We see a lot of use of strong brushstrokes, which is obvious in a lot of Van Gogh's work. But we see a lot of other traits from other isms, and it just doesn't really form its own distinct style in post-impressionism. We just have a lot of really interesting art going on here. Cézanne uses multiple perspectives, perhaps for the first time that had ever been seen in art. I chose this particular piece, The Forest, done by Paul Cézanne, mostly because it's kind of a transitional looking piece. It's not really an impressionist work, although we definitely see trees and we get the impression of trees in a forest without it being a realistic portrayal. We have very strong use of color in bolder strokes than, say, the Impressionists might use or the Pointillists would use, which is coming next. But we definitely have use of black. We have a strong sense of color. It's kind of a tweener of an ism, if you want to use it that way. We go into Pointillism now, which is all about science and structure. Georges Seurat is considered the founder of Pointillism. Paul Signac was one of his disciples. They were friends and they did work together, but Signac lived longer than Georges Seurat, who died tragically at a young age. And the science behind Pointillism is about the fact that when color is set next to other colors, your eye plays a trick and convinces you that you're seeing something else. So these small dots of color were placed next to each other, often in complementary or opposite placements than what they would be on the color wheel. And your eye plays a trick into seeing colors as a whole as opposed to individual. It's a very time-consuming process, and it has almost a static quality to it, a stillness to it, even though it required a lot of brushstroke and a lot of movement here. I selected this piece because it's obvious that you can see these small dots of color and you can see the placement next to these opposite colors. And yet, if you stand back, you have a completely different vision of this piece. This was a work by Paul Signac of the Papal Palace in Avignon. Our next movement is Fovism. You may not have heard of this one. It was a relatively short-lived movement, ran basically from 1905 to 1908. We would definitely consider Gauguin to be part of the Fauvist movement, along with the post-expressionist movement. The term Fauvism translates to wild beasts, and I think that's a reference to their use of color. This was the very first avant-garde movement in art. And it's called that because of the distortion in the form and the funky use of perspective. We have two German schools of Fauvist work. We have Die Brücke, which translates to the bridge, and that is technically moving from an old style into the avant-garde. And then we have Der Blaue Reiter, which translates to the blue rider. And this was a movement founded by Franz Marc, which links color to emotion. So Kandinsky was one of the more prominent artists in this. The Fauvists as a whole eliminate recognizable reality. So they portray trees, which we can recognize, but they use strange colors to show these trees. And they do animals and they do people, but the color association with those subjects would not be what we would expect. I selected this picture here, Bridge over Rieu, done in 1906 by André Derain, hangs in the MoMA Museum in New York. And it's a good example of how these very bright, bold colors change from what the Impressionists were doing, and lead into what the Expressionists could do. Primitivism is an interesting movement that started in the late 1800s and carries through to the mid 1900s. I selected this work by Picasso because it was one of his best known and certainly his first well-known masterpiece, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, done in 1907, also hanging in MoMA in New York. This shows a set of 5 women, but not women that we would ever see in this particular configuration, right? They're nude, and some of them have these mask-like qualities to their faces. That was by design. These are artists that are now looking to the age of pre-industrialization. They're looking to their past to find new inspirations for their art, new sources that they can draw from. So we have geometric quality here, which is going to be further explored in our next ism. We have abstraction still coming into play here. We have a lot of tribal qualities. Those masks are a great example of that. We have artists like Gauguin and Picasso. Gauguin was using nude women in island settings, and that would be a definite form of primitivism. But I think this example from Picasso is the best way to show a primitive inspiration in these artists' work. Now we have Expressionism. This runs from 1905 to 1920, and this is all about the raw emotion of the artist, the anxiety, the depression, the feelings of anxiety that society is going through right now because World War I is about to happen and everybody knows it. It's a much more subjective perspective, definitely not an objective approach. The way that these artists are portraying themselves. In this particular example, we have Egon Schiele, a German artist, in a self-portrait with Chinese lantern plant. This is a less disturbing portrayal than several of the works that came from this time period. We can think of Edvard Munch's The Scream and how so much anxiety and emotion is portrayed in that picture. And we have a less direct but the same amount of emotion shown in this particular self-portrait. There's a degree of distortion and of exaggeration, and artists are trying to create a discomfort between the art and the viewer. I think in many ways, Cubism was a response to the uncertainty worldwide. World War I was about to come, and there were so many things that were unknown. I think that Picasso and Georges Braque, the founders of Cubism, wanted to do something that was a little more tangible, a little more concrete, that had some structure to it. That's just my theory. But Cubism evolved between 1907 and 1914, and it was a pretty definitive period in art. Stuff like this had not been seen before. Picasso and Braque formulated an art that was based on geometry and on form, also allowing that negative space could take on parts of a structure. They also used collage as an element, and they used volume. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you have a paper cup and you use scissors to disassemble that paper cup and lay it out so that you can see all sides of the paper cup at once, that was the essence behind Cubism. So this was taking place opposite what was going on with the Fauvists, right? The Fauvists were all about bright colors and rebellion. The Cubists were very structured. Their color palette was fairly monochromatic. It was a pretty serious type of art, I think is a good way to describe it. I chose this piece here, Nude Descending a Staircase #2, done in 1912 by Marcel Duchamp, and one of his only real famous paintings done by Duchamp. But I like this one because not only is it a good illustration of the color palette that the Cubists chose, but it also shows motion. And by the title being Nude Descending a Staircase, one can actually see the human figure in motion coming down a staircase in a very geometric, strongly structured way. At the same time as Cubism, we had each country kind of flexing their artistic power. We had a movement called Constructivism, which occurs in the early 1900s in Russia. And that's all about the Russians showing off urban industry and technology and how modern they can become. We have a couple of artists. We have Vladimir Tatlin, who was an architect, and we have Kazimir Malevich. And this is one of Malevich's pieces here on the left, showing a very modern, abstract piece of work, almost in a deconstructed, geometric way, hence the name Constructivism. On the right, we have Futurism, also occurring at the same time as Cubism, and this was occurring primarily in Italy. And we don't think of Italy necessarily as being progressive-minded in their technology, but in this particular movement in the early 1900s, Italian artists were once again showing that they could spearhead a new movement in art. So this movement is all about speed and youth, violence and technology. And we have here a work by Boccioni that even though it was done 100 years ago, this still looks like a very modern or futuristic approach to art. Dadaism is all about the bad boys of art. And this was a response movement to what was happening in society. So war was occurring and people were upset and artists wanted to make a statement. So kind of like Banksy today, the 21st century graffiti artist, the Dadaists were taking art and they were making fun of what was happening in society. It was all about questioning the war movement and questioning our politicians and making a mockery out of the rules and authority that were dominating society at the time. So for example, Marcel Duchamp, who did our new Descending the Staircase, took the Mona Lisa and drew a mustache on her. So there was an irreverence to the art. This particular movement began in Zurich, Switzerland, and it was relatively short-lived. It started in 1916 and it only lasted for a few years, but it's all about the satire of society. The particular picture I chose here was called The Art Critic. It was done in 1919 and it's currently on display at the Tate, done by Raoul Haussmann, and I chose that one just because I like the title. But it shows clearly how people are taking artistic things and using them in a pointed sort of way. Dadaism and the war and the disillusionment by people about society leads us into Surrealism. And I think a lot of people have chosen Surrealism as their favorite movement just because it's so weird, right? It's about combining reality and dreamlike states into a product subconsciously. And there was some use of drugs involved sometimes. Artists that we know that were surrealists include Salvador Dali, René Magritte, Juan Miró, and they were taking art in a completely different new direction, subject matter-wise. They were releasing the unconscious mind, and they were opposing rationality and materialism into these dreamlike, nonsensical images of things. This one is called Metamorphosis of Narcissus. It was done in 1937 by Salvador Dali and hangs at the Tate Modern. And I can't even begin to tell you what's happening in this picture, so you'll have to create your own narrative here. Surrealism naturally gave way to abstract expressionism because surrealism really was a form of expressing oneself, and now we're doing so in an abstract way, kind of the same way the surrealists did, but now it's actually got a different ism title. Abstract expressionism started in 1940s in New York City. New York City had just become one of the centers of the art world, mostly because a lot of European immigrants came over to escape oppression during the war, World War II. So we have a lot of different styles and a lot of different approaches to art. They were working together and they were definitely discussing their different styles, and they were being schooled in a lot of different styles in New York. So we have abstract approaches, but abstraction is a pretty broad term. We have Jackson Pollock doing his action painting, where he literally throws paint at the canvas in a variety of ways. We have Mark Rothko doing color field painting, which basically meant he was taking huge swaths of color and seeing how they interacted with each other. And then we have a picture more like this one, Woman on Bicycle, done by Willem de Kooning, who was a Dutch immigrant into New York City. And this is, I think, how a lot of people think of abstract art, kind of a wild, irreverent take on a human being. You can tell it's a human only because we can see the facial features and we see the feet, so we have a rough idea of the figure, but it's not a particularly flattering portrayal. So I think a lot of people consider abstract art in this way, but abstract expressionism really is a very broad term covering a lot of different approaches. Now we go a completely different direction. And into the 50s and 60s, we have op art and pop art. Op art, of course, would stand for optical illusion art. Frank Stella's example here in the black and white is a good example. If you look at this picture, your eyes start to play tricks on you, right? And so that was something that kind of fit in with society in the 60s particularly, right? We had a lot of protests happening. We had Vietnam coming. And so artists were rebelling against what was happening in society. The other thing that was happening at the same time was pop art. And we automatically think of Andy Warhol as an example of a pop artist. And their approach was in bringing images that were instantly recognizable to everybody, regardless of whether you lived in Omaha or Zimbabwe, and making those subject matters approachable. So we have here an image of Marilyn Monroe, an icon, of course, of American film. But if you look at this picture, it's not four identical pictures of Marilyn Monroe. We can all instantly recognize her, but each of those images has been tweaked or changed in a number of ways. Maybe it's the intensity of the color. Maybe it's the way the silk screen approach lines up. But Warhol was trying to present the fact that we can all see the same subject matter, but we all will see it in a different way. So pop art was a reaction against abstract expressionism. And instead of taking objects that we couldn't necessarily recognize, it was about taking objects that we can recognize and presenting them in a different way. The focus of artists had actually become much more pointed towards society. So in the 60s and 70s, when we had the hippies and the beatnik generation, part of their response was against materialism and against the wealth and industrialism. And so we have a movement called Art Pavera, which translates to poor art, or using recycled objects in their art. This particular example, Venus of the Rags, was done in 1967 by Michelangelo Pistoletto. And it's a pretty clear statement here what he's doing. He's showing a pile of clothes, modern day clothes. We can tell by their patterns and by the fact that we have kind of a cotton knit material. So it looks like a bunch of rejected t-shirts. And we have them thrown in a pile as if they've been discarded in front of a more classic sculpture of either Greek or Roman origin. So they're making a statement here about society, about how you don't have to necessarily throw away or discard things, that they can still be useful, or that we just look down on things that have already been used, right? You can make your own narrative based on this particular installation. Like Art Pavera before this, Minimalism is a response to consumer waste and materialism and the fact that things are so much easier to acquire now. Artists were rebelling against this, and they felt that art should have its own reality. In other words, it didn't have to imitate or be based on anything in particular. So they use a lot of objective visual elements, and the artist doesn't necessarily have to be the one to create these elements. The example I've given you here is a piece by Donald Judd. This is one of his series that was deemed stacks, and it's a stack of manufactured boxes. Each stack sculpture involves different colors, different sizes. Sometimes the materials are different and reflect light onto the walls where these boxes have been installed. Judd was about wanting the box itself and the arrangement of the box to be the art. And the space between these boxes also was considered to be part of the art. Another artist from this movement was Carl Andre, who used very simple recycled materials in his art. So he may take a series of steel plates and lie them down on the floor in an arrangement. And just by virtue of those plates being on the floor and the viewer being able to interact with those plates, you became part of the art. So it was a minimalist approach as far as the artist's involvement in the art itself. The art could have been manufactured, but the artist comes up with the idea. Which leads us nicely into our next and final ism of this presentation, conceptual art. Conceptual art also occurred between the 1960s and 1970s, and like minimalism, it's more about the idea behind the work as opposed to the work itself. The art is in the eye of the viewer, and it encompassed both visual and verbal representation, and it could involve objects that were made by people other than the artist. I selected this particular example, 1 and 3 chairs, done in 1965 by Joseph Kossuth, and this is shown at MoMA in New York. 1 and 3 chairs shows 3 different examples or concepts of a chair. We have the photograph of a chair, we have the actual chair, and we have the dictionary definition or the verbal representation of a chair. So all 3 objects are the same chair or could be defined as a chair or explained or conceptualized as a chair. It just depends on the eye of the viewer. There are many other isms or art periods that I could have included in this. We could have talked about land art or performance art or art that uses text, but I think I've tired out the whole ism idea here and given you a pretty good exploration over almost 200 years of production. I hope you enjoyed my talk today. If you know of anybody that might be interested, by all means feel free to share this video and send me any feedback or questions to the email indicated on this slide. Stay well, stay safe. I hope to be back with you again soon, and I look forward to bringing you more articulating art talks. Thank you.